This is a miniature model of a yogurt shop that was once in Austin, Texas, where 4 young girls' lives were suddenly cut short. Hi, I'm Carol, and I'm going to take you behind the tape and into the crime scene of the yogurt shop murders with this miniature model that I created. Once a place where people would come in, sit down, and enjoy a sweet treat, this local hangout would suddenly become a place that would be remembered for the horrific events that took place on December 6, 1991. At 11:47 p.m. on that fateful night, a police officer was driving by the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. To his shock, the store was engulfed in flames. He immediately called for backup. Firefighters arrived to extinguish what they thought was an after-hours fire. What they found instead was a shocking cover-up of the quadruple murder of 4 teenage girls. Once the flames were extinguished, authorities were left with a tragic mystery, and unfortunately, it's one that had most of its evidence burned and washed away, leaving a devastating scene where the bodies of sisters Sarah Harbison, 15, Jennifer Harbison, 17, Eliza Thomas, 17, and Amy Ayers, 13, were discovered stacked on top of one another in the shop's back room. Reportedly, the girls were stripped, bound, and cold-bloodedly shot execution style. Some of the victims also showed signs of having been sexually assaulted. John Jones, the original detective assigned to the case, said, "I'd seen homicides, but not 4, and not 4 all tied up, and not 4 stripped down, and not 4 burned." The 2 older teens, Jennifer and Eliza, worked at the yogurt shop. The younger girls, Sarah and Amy, had stopped by to wait for the older girls to lock up. There had been plans for a sleepover later that evening. What was the motive behind this heinous crime against 4 innocent girls? Upon further investigation, the store appeared to have been robbed, and the front door was locked from the inside. Authorities were only able to enter through that door with a key. The back door, however, was unlocked, suggesting that someone may have entered and exited from this back entrance. The discovery only amounted to more questions, leaving behind a puzzling story. Desperate for answers, the yogurt shop owners offered a cash reward of $125,000 for information that led to a conviction. One couple who was interviewed after having gone into the yogurt shop as customers that same evening claimed to remember seeing one of the girls lock the door behind them when they left, further supporting the theory that the back door was the perpetrator's access point. 2 years into the investigation, Austin Police Department had reportedly looked into over 5,000 leads and at one point had 342 possible suspects. Despite this, there were no arrests for 8 years. Of those 342 suspects were 4 teenage boys. At the time, they were not arrested for the murders due to lack of evidence. However, in 1999, the case had been assigned to new investigators who arrested and charged those same suspects, who'd now become adults: Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. The new team felt that there was sufficient evidence to carry on interrogating and later charging the 4 men for the 1991 yogurt shop murders. Around the time of the murders, Maurice Pierce had been arrested for having a .22 caliber on his person while at a nearby mall. He was 16 years old at the time. Police wanted to know where the gun had been on December 6th. Pierce claimed Forrest Wellborn, his then 15-year-old friend, had borrowed the gun that day. Soon, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, who were 17 and 16 years old at the time of the murders, were brought into the mix. The teenagers had been with Pierce and Wellborn on December 6th in the relative area of the yogurt shop. During their 1999 questioning, Pierce and Wellborn did not admit any guilt during their interrogations. Both Scott and Springsteen initially denied any involvement, but their stories changed as time went on. After hours and days of interrogations, Scott's story shifted from not knowing anything about it to a confession of shooting 2 girls and sexually assaulting 1 girl. Similarly, Springsteen's story began with the claim he wasn't within 100 yards of the yogurt shop. As the interrogation went on, however, he eventually confessed to shooting and raping one of the victims. He also claimed his 3 friends were involved. All 4 men were charged. Pierce and Wellborn, who denied involvement entirely, were not indicted and were eventually released. Scott and Springsteen, however, moved on to defend themselves in court. After their initial interrogation and arrests in 1999, Scott and Springsteen were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in 2001. There was no physical evidence, just their confessions to the crime. It was later determined through ballistics testing that the gun Pierce was in possession of when he was arrested at the mall was highly unlikely to be the murder weapon. At this point, it seemed that the case was closed until 5 years later, in 2006. That year, Springsteen's conviction was overturned. Then, in 2007, Scott's conviction was overturned as well. Both men received new trials. It was determined that their Sixth Amendment rights were not protected. The argument was that confession tapes were used by the prosecution without the opportunity for either man to confront witnesses against them, as the amendment entails. Additionally, both Scott and Springsteen's lawyers alleged that their clients were coerced into giving false confessions during the interrogation process and were innocent. And despite making a confession with notably concerning details, such as the type of gun used at the crime scene and the position of one of the victim's bodies, Springsteen later recanted his confession, stating that he'd been berated during the interrogation process and had finally broken down under pressure. The retrials weren't the only update. There was now new physical evidence to consider that had not been available before. A partial DNA sample pulled from the youngest victim, Amy Ayers. This kind of partial sample can identify whether a person shares male lineage with whoever supplied the DNA sample through a process called YSTR testing. In 2009, Scott and Springsteen were set to be tried again. The prosecution delayed the trials for as long as possible, but the new DNA testing showed no match to either suspect. The charges against Scott and Springsteen were dropped. What was likely a relief for the men believed to have been involved was now a major disappointment for the victims' families seeking justice for their loved ones. We may never truly know whether or not these confessions were fully false. What we do know, however, is that the partial DNA sample did not match Scott or Springsteen. The murders of Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, and Amy are now back to being unsolved. The idea that two men gave detailed confessions to a gruesome murder, then later claimed that they were coerced, did not sit well with some people. However, what most people don't know is that these weren't the only confessions provided during the investigation that were later deemed unlikely. In fact, there had been a total of 6 written confessions during the investigation process. Scott and Springsteen's were just the only ones that led to formal charges. So, even if one of these confessions was genuine, that still leaves a number of people who admitted to horrible, deadly crimes that they likely did not commit. You may be wondering, why would anyone do that? According to the Innocence Project, there have been 375 DNA exonerations in the United States since the very first one in 1989. 29% of those exonerations involved a false confession. That's more than 1 in 4 DNA exonerations. There are a number of reasons why false confessions are made, but many of them have to do with the interrogation process itself. According to experts, it's designed to induce stress, ideally to get a guilty conscience to confess. But enough pressure could also cause an innocent person to say whatever it takes to escape the situation. Interrogations are legally allowed to take place for hours, even over the course of multiple days. They can utilize real or imaginary evidence to convince a suspect to confess. For example, a detective could say, "We found your fingerprint at the scene." They can also say that they have a witness or that someone confessed on your behalf, even if it was completely fabricated. Another stressful factor is time. On average, the Innocence Project found that exonerees were interrogated for 16 hours. In this case, Scott was interrogated for 20 hours over the course of 5 days. When the interrogation process began, Scott claimed he was not involved. After 20 hours, his story changed to assaulting 1 victim and shooting 2 victims. Since the release of Scott and Springsteen in 2009, there has been very little public leeway on the yogurt shop murders. Though the DNA provided the physical evidence that had been long missing from this case, it had been compared against the DNA of 100 men with no success until 2017. A match was finally made. YSTR testing, which can be done on some partial DNA samples, can't quite pinpoint an individual like a full DNA sample can. However, it will identify whether someone is a part of the same male lineage as the person who supplied the sample. But this could be as direct as your brother or as indirect as a cousin on your dad's side that you've never met. The match came from a public research database run from the University of Central Florida. The specific DNA sample it matched with had been provided by the FBI and was originally taken for a population study. This meant that the individual whose DNA was in the database had some male lineage in common with the person who left the DNA behind at the 1991 crime scene. This was the first new lead in decades, but frustratingly, the story may stop there. Though this connection was found in 2017, the identity of the person in the database has been withheld by the FBI. Their reasoning is that it would be an unconstitutional breach of privacy for the individual whose DNA was provided randomly and not as a potential suspect. However, in recent years, the same type of testing proved successful in the infamous Boston Strangler case, whose identity was confirmed as the long-suspected Albert DeSalvo, whose DNA was matched with his nephew's. Unfortunately, in the case of the yogurt shop murders, as far as we know, this is where the story has left off. The 4 lives lost back in 1991 are still remembered and desperately missed. 4 girls who were friends, who had their lives cut short far too soon. To this day, while unsolved, this case remains open. What do you think? Should there be special circumstances where DNA samples collected for other reasons be allowed to help solve a criminal case? Or is that a slippery slope toward a total lack of privacy surrounding DNA? Let me know your thoughts and what other cases you'd like me to explore through miniatures.